This video was primarily inspired by a comment. Be sure to leave suggestions on what writing topics you'd like me to consider, and I'll probably do it. Second time's the charm recording this one, but at least it's a shorter video today. If you haven't seen my general character development video, I recommend watching that first. That video covers the more universal parts of character development, and I'll be assuming that information is a given for everything I say in this video without repeating all of it. Additionally, that video was kind of directed towards writing protagonists, so I think now it's time to talk about the antagonists. I will talk about 4 different kinds of antagonists and how to write each one. One last little note is that while I will say the word villain a lot in this video, as that word is in all 4 antagonistic types, antagonist and villain are not at all synonymous no matter what anyone tells you. Protagonist and antagonist are not fancy words for good and bad characters, they are positions in a story. The protagonist is the character the story is in perspective of. The antagonist is the character who works against the protagonist. There is no such thing that has an antagonist as the main character. It just means the protagonist is a villain and the antagonist is most likely a hero. Let's start by looking at what the role of the antagonist really is. Stories can only exist in conflict. Sure, the protagonist has to be for something, but they also have to be against something. Anything where the protagonist does not struggle with anything at all will inevitably fail. So, the protagonist has to have something or someone to fight for, and there has to be something or someone who poses a direct and serious threat. That's the antagonist. The antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a character. It can be a natural disaster or a monster or whatever you need, but character antagonists are traditionally the most popular, so I will only be discussing how to write those today. First up, we have the classic villains. You know, the bad guys. While all 4 antagonist types I'll talk about have villain in the name, keep in mind that I'm specifically talking about villains that are not intended to be sympathetic in any way right now. These are your murderers, bank robbers, world conquerors, world destroyers, and so on. They want money, power, or chaos. These are the antagonists readers and audiences want to see punished or killed. Something to consider before writing one of these is that they are not really in vogue anymore. I mean, yeah, they still exist, but most writers, literateurs, directors, and cinephiles like to roll their eyes at these. They will call these antagonists one-dimensional. The thing is, that's not entirely true. Yes, they are very straightforward, but make no mistake, a classic-style villain can still be a round character. A one-dimensional villain is not because they are a classic villain, they are one-dimensional because they simply weren't developed. If a classic villain is what serves your story, then do it. Writing a villain is relatively easy to do. Comedies can get away with leaning into the tropes a bit and satirizing them. For more serious work, you just need to be realistic about motive. Most people don't think of themselves as the bad guy, even when everyone else believes they are. As such, when you design a classic villain, I recommend playing into delusion, anger, greed, hatred, or ego. In other words, a classic villain is always selfish. They serve themselves and no others. The next type of antagonist would be the sympathetic villain. I think the term sympathetic villain is misleading though. People use the term as a blanket to refer to actual sympathetic villains as well as tragic villains, which I'm discussing next, all because people take sympathy to mean pity. As such, I will instead call sympathetic villains reasonable villains and keep tragic villains independent. I think a good example of a reasonable villain is Thanos. You don't feel sorry for him, but you can trace and understand what the underlying logic of his plans are. He's not trying to kill half of all intelligent life because he wants to torture everyone. He's trying to kill half of all intelligent life because he thinks that's what will save the universe after his experiences on his home planet. Is it right? No, that's why he's the antagonist. The point is that he's also making sacrifices as part of his own hero's journey, even if he isn't actually a hero. As you will have noticed, reasonable villains are now the most popular. I've heard some people claim that writers started using these because it makes their work seem more intelligent, but I think that's only half true. Believe me, I've talked to a lot of other writers, and there are plenty who genuinely and wholeheartedly see themselves as the greatest minds of today. It's funny because those same writers, I've read their actual writing, and it's not as good as the amateurs I've mentored or instructed in the past. However, I think most writers gravitate towards reasonable villains simply because they are more fun and interesting to write. I'm one of them. There's just so much more material for you to work with when you have an antagonist that feels like a broken protagonist. There's more room for development, and there are more directions you can take them. Classic villains are either defeated for a satisfying ending, or victorious to instill unrest from the readers or audience. Reasonable villains can go either way without any issues depending on the choices they've made. They either suffer for their cause, or they see the light. Writing them is a bit more complicated than writing a classic villain, but complicated doesn't mean hard, it just means there's more to do. Basically, you fill out the character as you did for your protagonist. You know, make sure the main plot completes their personal story, that they have an internal contradiction, and that they act as a real person would in their situation. The difference is that you need to find a cause that can have plausibly heroic goals or reasonable motives, but is something your protagonist can't stand for. There is a complication, though. Don't accidentally make your antagonist the protagonist. Ultimately, you need your readers to side with the protagonist. I highly advise that you do not make the antagonist more appealing than the protagonist. Remember, the antagonist is not the main character. If you make a sympathetic villain too sympathetic, then the thesis of your story will be eroded. The tragic villain is very similar to the reasonable villain, and I've seen people who classify tragic villains as sympathetic and thus cause confusion, but I prefer to make them distinct. Tragic villains are when a character has a very traumatic backstory that's the main cause of their evil actions. They want revenge, redemption, or some other shift in the social balance, either in macro or micro scales. The idea is that they sometimes understand what they're doing is wrong, but believe there is no other way. Often, tragic villains that seek redemption are given it in another form. Maybe they think they have to prove themselves one way, but instead prove themselves another. Writing a tragic villain can be a little more difficult to get right than reasonable villains. People generally cheer for the person who perseveres when the odds are against them. That's why underdog heroes are such a hit. However, unless you are giving a redemptive ending, don't make your readers or audience take their side. Like the reasonable villains, they can easily win too much favor from the readers and audience away from the protagonist. If you aren't going to redeem them, make sure they're responsible for enough bad that readers don't find the ending unjust. Still, the tragedy lies in the pity of the readers for the situation the antagonist was in. The last kind of antagonist is a very heavily debated one, the anti-villain. They mostly exist to be the opposite of an anti-hero, but as the internet seems to misunderstand anti-heroes as it is, information about anti-villains is hard to trust. I'll do a video taking a closer look at anti-heroes, but for now, let's just stick to anti-heroes being characters with a somewhat noble goal, but using dishonorable or otherwise questionable means to get there. As such, an anti-villain would be a character with maligned goals but using honorable or otherwise moral means to get there. Like, an anti-hero might kill an unarmed leader of organized crime instead of capturing them alive. An anti-villain might save the life of their adversary just so they'd have to endure more suffering if possible. They are experimental, so there aren't any accepted hard rules for how they operate. It is my personal preference that I don't like to write anti-villains. The implications that they tend to bring to the story push it in directions that aren't my favorite to write. Still, they are interesting. Writing them isn't too difficult, but I will say writing a story that actually makes use of them is. A good anti-villain antagonist is going to need a protagonist that can handle them. An anti-hero is the obvious pick, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's right, because if you have a protagonist that does a lot of wrong for an allegedly right cause, the readers might side with the antagonist because they are doing good things for a cause that might as well be right to them. On a closely related note, the plot and the world both need to make it absolutely clear the protagonist is in the right, or at the very least, the overall cause is better than the antagonist. I mentioned this a few times today, but I think I should probably talk about antagonists and endings for a minute. Something non-negotiable is that the protagonist needs to have a completed arc. Sure, there are plenty of examples where the protagonist doesn't win, so to speak, but they still have to have some kind of resolution or definitive endpoint. The thing about antagonists is that it can go in quite a few directions, and nearly everyone I talk to has strong feelings about what kinds of endings an antagonist, quote, should have. Some people hate the idea of redeeming antagonists. Others think putting the antagonist in some kind of prison is cliché. Still others think killing antagonists off is too easy. Naturally, a three-way split on something like this means there isn't a right answer, so go ahead and ignore the ranters. I will give some guidance on how to tick the smallest amount of people off, though. Reasonable villains do well with death scenes, actually. Take Lord Cutler Beckett's death, for example. Throughout the original Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, the movies showed the mythical side of the story and how the characters dealt with it. The pirates are the ones who understand their own traditions and how to survive in an ecosystem of magic, curses, and monsters, as well as the other pirates and navies. Beckett is physically the weakest antagonist, and yet he's the most dangerous. He's able to conquer and control, and upsets the old balances of the sea. But every action he does makes sense. Sure, he's prideful and arrogant, but he believes he's bringing order, safety, and prosperity for the people he cares about. His death scene is perfect. The two sides of the pirates' ecosystem, the pirates and the myths, both had to unite to defeat Beckett. In turn, Beckett sees this and accepts his fate. He knows he played the cards he had, but lost. In the same way he lived making deals in the name of good business instead of getting physical, he does not run to a lifeboat or shout in fury or other violent acts. Instead, he bows out. It just makes the most sense to end his character that way. Meanwhile, tragic villains tend to do well with redemptive endings. Take Nebula in the MCU, for example. She did a lot of bad, but the more you learn about her, the more you realize why she does what she does. She's able to recognize where she was wrong, and is eventually forgiven. Of course, that's not to say tragic villains have to be redeemed. If you're writing a tragedy, then yeah, tragic villains probably shouldn't be redeemed. My point in all of this is that the ending you choose for your antagonists must be what makes the most sense for completing their own arc, but also the arcs of the protagonist and the plot. The antagonist's role is to add drama and tension to the story, so you must respect that role as you write it. If you make them too weak or end them too cheaply, then the entire story suffers. I hope this was a helpful look at antagonists and will aid you in creating the one you need for your own story. The next video is about anti-heroes. Keep writing.